Ukraine is the elephant in the room of Europe. Think about it. Europe is the most peaceful continent on the planet, except for Ukraine. This country has been invaded by Russia for 6 years, and the question is, what is NATO doing about it? In previous VisualPolitik videos, we've already told you why Ukraine is the poorest country in Europe. And yes, it is true, the main factor to explain all this mystery is the corruption of the Ukrainian elites themselves. However, it is undeniable that the Russian invasion makes it very difficult for Ukraine to pull itself out of this poverty. Take a look at this map. Since 2014, the Crimean Peninsula has been directly controlled by Russia. In addition, these two easternmost regions, which are called Donetsk and Luhansk, are controlled by separatists, who, in turn, are supported by Russia. At any moment, Russia could try to conquer more regions. So the question is, would you set up a factory or an office in Ukraine, knowing that, at any moment, the city you are in could go to war? And you'll say, come on, do you really think that Russia could invade more regions of Ukraine? And the answer is, why wouldn't they? Think of it this way. The war between Ukraine and Russia is totally imbalanced. Ukraine spends about $5.2 billion a year on its armed forces. Russia spends $65 billion. And that explains why news stories like this one are so concerning.
Ukraine says Russia still has 100,000 troops near its borders. Al Jazeera, 11th of May, 2021.
For the time being, Russia has not advanced its positions. At least, not since 2014. But if one day they did, what could Ukraine do? How could they defend themselves? As you can imagine, the situation in this country is critical, and that explains why the Ukrainians' #1 wish is this.
Ukraine wants to speed up joining NATO to send a real signal to Russia. Euronews, the 6th of April, 2021.
So why is it so important for Ukraine to join NATO, you may ask? In case some of you don't know, NATO is a defense union. That is, if you attack a member country, the rest are obliged to retaliate. In other words, if Ukraine were a NATO member country, the United States, Germany, France, and Spain would have to send troops to defend them. They would no longer be alone against the Russian Empire. So the question is it possible for Ukraine to join NATO? And is NATO really ready to accept them? And more importantly, how are Ukraine's armed forces preparing to defend themselves against Russia? Today, we're going to answer these questions. But first, let's take a look at a bit of history.
Vodka, rackets, and Kalashnikovs.
They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I'm going to show you a video in order for you to understand how the Ukrainian army operated up until the 2014 war. What I'm going to show you now is real. It is an official recruitment announcement for joining the Ukrainian armed forces. Let's take a look at it because it's absolutely priceless. Well, here we see some sort of Ukrainian yokel trying to pick up some chicks by showing off his brand new BMW, something that's obviously pretty typical in Ukraine. But suddenly, something unexpected happens. A tank appears. Also pretty normal in Ukraine, apparently. And in that tank, there are 3 soldiers with so much makeup on that they look like Barbie's boyfriend Ken. And here, the soldier called Dmitry climbs down and asks the girls for some water. And of course, the girls pass on the yokel. You know, guys, if you want to pull chicks in Ukraine, a tank is better than a BMW. And here it is, when they share with you the ultimate reason for enlisting in the Ukrainian army. Check it out.
А ми і так дома, ввечері в клубі.
There you have it. In any other country, enrollment ads appeal to patriotism, sacrifice, or military values. The Ukrainians wanted citizens to sign up for the army because its soldiers get to spend all night long showing off the girls in their shiny tank and partying. Remember, this ad is real, and it was paid for by the Ukrainian government. So this means that this was the impression Ukraine had of its own army. The ad keeps going. Now they talk for a while. I work in the army. I want to marry you. Do you have an Insta? And then the soldiers leave.
Після роботи.
Якої роботи?
Звичайної. Контракт.
Який контракт?
Ukrainian army. Why choose between making love or making war when you can have both? Well, after seeing this masterpiece, I'm going to give you some data that will leave you terrified. Ukraine is one of the largest arms exporters in the world. That's right. During the Soviet era, Ukraine produced 30% of the USSR's armaments. There were more than 1 million people working in the more than 750 Ukrainian arms factories. And you will say, so what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union? Well, something that probably won't surprise you much. Almost the entire Soviet arsenal disappeared. That's right. It is estimated that between 1992 and 98, Ukraine lost more than $32 billion worth of armaments. So, where did all those weapons go? Well, to wars like Sierra Leone, Croatia, etc. This was, after all, the golden age for illegal arms dealers. But the story does not end there. Arms dealers aside, the Ukrainian state also did huge business with armaments. All those former Soviet factories were still producing, and what were they producing exactly? Well, mainly Russian weapon parts. For example, most of the engines used in Russian helicopters were labeled "Made in Ukraine." To give you an idea, in 2012, Ukraine was the 4th largest arms exporter in the world, and its main customers were Pakistan, China, and of course, Russia. All this explains why, up until 2014, the majority of Ukrainians said no to joining NATO.
Ukraine says no to NATO. It is not surprising that about half of Ukrainians, 51%, gave NATO an unfavourable rating. Pew Research Centre, 29th of March, 2010.
And I know what you're thinking. So, Ukraine is a military power. How is it possible that Russia dares to invade them? There are two very important things that we need to understand. The first is that Ukraine only exported parts for manufacturing weapons. In other words, Ukraine was barely capable of producing any specific weapon. But that's not all. As you can imagine, the Ukrainian military industry was no stranger to corruption. To give you an idea, in 2010, all arms companies were unified under one conglomerate, Ukroboronprom. This company employs more than 80,000 people. However, in 10 years, they have barely managed to manufacture one single tank in its entirety. As usual in this country, almost all the money for armaments ended up in the pockets of oligarchs and politicians. So what about the army? Well, looking at the video I showed you earlier, you can already get an idea. In 2014, Ukraine had 168,000 soldiers. The territorial army had 41,000 troops, for example. But of those 41,000 troops, only 6,000 were ready to fight. And when I say ready to fight, I mean that they were trained and equipped. That is, only 6,000 soldiers had such basic things as boots, camouflage suits, and rifles. Given this situation, you will understand why the Russian invasion was a military walkover. And the question that you may be wondering now is, how can Ukraine defend itself today? Have they changed their army? Or are they just going to surrender sooner or later? Well, we're going to take a look at that right now.
A crowd-funded army.
In case anybody is a bit lost in this story, let's recap. In 2013, thousands of Ukrainians took to the streets in protest and overthrew the government, which was pro-Russian. In 2014, Ukraine appointed a new government that was anti-Russian. This provoked the Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine to want to secede from the country. Russia invaded the Crimean Peninsula and supported the separatist rebels of the Donbas region. I know this is a very broad summary, but if you want it in more detail, we have several videos where we cover this conflict in depth. As I mentioned earlier, Ukraine had hardly any soldiers to fight on the front lines. Well, thousands of civilians went to war of their own volition. That's right, ordinary citizens with no training, no weapons, no equipment whatsoever, got in their cars and went to the front to fight. That's how the volunteer battalions were born. Within these battalions, there were people of all types and ideologies. If you follow Russian propaganda channels, you already know that many of them were neo-Nazi groups, but alongside them, there were also Muslim groups. And you're probably thinking, Muslims in Ukraine? Yes, there were. For example, the Sheikh Mansour Battalion were warriors who came from Chechnya to support the cause. And you may ask, but what is the use of having so many warriors if they don't even have weapons? Remember that these volunteers could be any one of you. Can you imagine that? Suddenly, you find yourself fighting on a front line. How do you get a rifle? Who pays for it? Well, take a look.
Crowdfunding a war. In a David versus Goliath-like battle, Ukrainian forces looked to private companies and crowd-funded volunteer organizations to develop defense software and drone hardware in their fight against Russia. The Guardian, the 24th of May, 2015.
That's right. Faced with the vacuum left by the official army, Ukrainians organized themselves in their own way. This is how NGOs like Come Back Alive emerged, buying bulletproof vests and night vision goggles for volunteer soldiers. This NGO alone raised more than $100,000 in its first 45 days of existence. So where did they get so much money in a country as poor as Ukraine? Well, the answer is from the Ukrainian diaspora. There are more than 20 million Ukrainians scattered around the world. Around 345,000 of them live in the United States and have enough money to make donations. So in a very short time, volunteer armies raised millions of dollars to buy guns, boots, and all kinds of military equipment. And you will say, what a nice story, right? An army created by the people. Actually, there is another uglier name for this practice. We're actually talking about illegal arms trafficking. And that explains news stories like this.
PayPal doesn't work in Ukraine, but resourceful locals know how to use it. The Kiev Post, 5th of October 2018.
But we're not just talking about PayPal. One of the conditions set by the US for sending weapons to Ukraine was that all those volunteer groups would join the regular army. In fact, by 2019, almost all of those volunteers were already regular soldiers. And this is where the good news finally comes in. Because these volunteer forces are much more motivated and harder to corrupt. Remember that in 2014, Ukraine barely had any combat-ready soldiers. Well, right now, we're talking about 250,000 troops. They don't have particularly good weaponry, but at least they all have boots, suits, and rifles. Ukraine's army has changed from the bottom up, but it's better if you take a look for yourselves. Check out the new advertisement for recruiting soldiers.
Вчитель фізкультури.
Я студент-геолог.
У мене своя фірма.
I think it speaks for itself. In any case, the question you may be asking yourselves is all this enough to defend Ukraine against a Russian attack? Or is NATO assistance still necessary? Well, we're going to look at that right now.
Could Ukraine join NATO?
The short answer to this question? No. I mean, nobody can predict the future. At VisualPolitik, we don't have a crystal ball, but it is very difficult to imagine Ukraine joining NATO, for one very simple reason. If Ukraine joins NATO, Russia would have its enemy on the border. This would be reason enough for Russia to go to open war to avoid it. In other words, it is very risky. And as sad as it sounds for the Ukrainians watching this video, the reward does not outweigh the risk. We could say that this thinking is what has guided the US and EU stance in recent years. And you will say, so no one is willing to do anything to defend Ukraine? Not exactly. They just want to do it differently. You see, since 2014, the United States has spent over $2.5 billion in military aid to Ukraine. That might sound like a lot of money, but in reality, it's a drop in the bucket when compared to the more than $6.4 trillion that has been spent on wars in the Middle East. In any case, this money has been enough to send an arsenal that has been key for avoiding casualties. For example, Ukraine has now more than 300 Humvees, which are those armored all-terrain vehicles that you see in the movies. They have also sent anti-artillery radars. With this equipment alone, Ukraine is estimated to have reduced casualties by 70%. NATO has also sent thousands of instructors to train the soldiers. And you will say, that's all? Couldn't they have just sent them some artillery and rifles? At the end of the day, both radars and Humvees are useless for attacking. We're talking about a war, so where are the lethal weapons? And this is where we come back to what I mentioned before. NATO wants to avoid attacks at all costs. The goal is to prevent the situation from escalating, and you could see that very well with this example.
Ukraine gets US military aid, including Javelin anti-tank missiles. Reuters, 17th of June 2020.
Have you ever played Call of Duty? If so, you're probably familiar with the Javelin rocket launcher. It's a portable rocket launcher system. That is, that you carry it on your shoulders and you fire projectiles that destroy tanks. Now, that's a lethal weapon, and it's not just any weapon. To give you an idea, each of the units costs $280,000, but that's just the cannon. Each rocket costs $174,000. In other words, for the same cost as a single Javelin shot, you could buy an apartment in almost any city in the world. As you can imagine, these rocket launchers would be crucial in a battle against Russian tanks. But there's a catch. Ukraine can't have its 37 brand new Javelins on the front line. That's right. They are forced to store them in a depot in the western regions of the country, hundreds of kilometers away from the war zone. And why, you may ask? What is the point of sending weapons to a country and not letting them use them? There is a one-word answer: deterrence. Neither the United States nor NATO wants Ukraine to attack Russia, nor do they want to arouse Putin's fury. So they limit themselves to enough weaponry to deter Russia from escalating the war. In other words, it is very difficult to think that Ukraine would ever join NATO. However, NATO is helping Ukraine to modernize its military so that it can withstand further attacks. But now the question is over to you. Do you think that this is enough? Will we see new attacks from Russia again? Is it just a matter of time before NATO has to enter fully into this conflict? Do you think Ukraine can really modernize its military? Or is it going to be impossible to stamp out corruption? You can leave me your answers in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on VisualPolitik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. And if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and I'll be seeing you in the next one. All the best, see you soon.